You ever been arrested for breaking into your own property? The question hit the air just as the sirens bounced across the lake, echoing off the water like something out of a bad dream. And I could already smell the mix of wet wood, gasoline, and that sharp metallic edge that comes right before things go sideways. And there she was, Margaret Whitmore, standing on my dock in a pressed white outfit that didn't belong anywhere near mud or real work, pointing at me like she just caught a criminal red-handed, her voice cutting through the morning calm. "That's him, officer." He forced his way in, and I just stood there, boots still damp from the shoreline, keys in my hand, looking at the same cabin I'd walked into 100 times before, except now it felt different, like the walls were watching, like the air had shifted, and the crunch of gravel behind me told me the deputies had already made up their minds before they even spoke, because that's how it works out here. HOA president calls, you respond. No questions first, just action, and I could hear one of them say, "Sir, we're going to need you to step away from the property." Like I wasn't already standing on ground I knew better than my own living room. And Margaret stepped closer, perfume cutting through the lake air, sweet but sharp, like something trying too hard to hide what it really was. And she held up a folder, thick, organized, rehearsed, the kind of paperwork people like her carry around like a weapon. "This property is under HOA jurisdiction," she said, slow and confident, like she'd practiced that line in a mirror, like she'd been waiting for this exact moment. And I didn't say anything. Not yet. Just watched the way her fingers tightened around the papers, the way her smile didn't quite reach her eyes, the way the neighbors started gathering at the edge of the gravel road. Phones already out, recording, because nothing spreads faster than someone else's problem, and I could feel the weight of their eyes, the quiet judgment, the assumption that I was exactly who she said I was, just another guy who didn't belong. And the deputy took a step closer, hand hovering near his belt. Not aggressive, just ready. And he said it again, slower this time. "Sir, I need you to step away." And I glanced past him just for a second at the mailbox near the steps, paint slightly chipped, sunlight hitting the metal just right. And there it was, her name, Margaret Whitmore, clean, centered, exactly where it was supposed to be. And I felt something settle in my chest. Not anger, not panic, something quieter, sharper, like a switch flipping into place, because I'd seen this before, different place, different face, same mistake. People who think volume equals authority, people who think if they say something loud enough, long enough, everyone else would just fall in line. And Margaret kept talking, filling the silence like she owned it. "He doesn't have permission to be here. This is a restricted community. We have rules." And the word rules hung in the air like it meant more than it actually did, like it could override everything else, like it could erase facts. And I finally looked back at her, really looked this time at the perfect hair, the calculated posture, the certainty, and I realized she wasn't guessing. She was convinced, completely convinced she was right. And that's the part that always makes it worse, because people like that don't hesitate. They don't second guess. They just push forward louder, harder until someone stops them. And I could feel the moment tightening, the deputies waiting, the neighbors watching, Margaret smiling just a little wider. And I let the silence stretch just long enough to make her comfortable, just long enough for her to believe she'd already won. And then I shifted my grip on the keys, metal clicking softly against my palm, and thought to myself, you're about to learn something about ownership that no HOA handbook ever taught you. The deputy's radio crackled softly at his shoulder, a low static hum that mixed with the gentle slap of water against the dock. And for a second, everything felt suspended, like the whole scene was waiting for someone to decide which version of reality was about to win. And Margaret took that silence as permission, stepping forward again, heels clicking against the wood like she owned every inch of it. "I have already told you, officers, this man does not belong here," she said, slower now, more deliberate, like she was tightening a knot she thought I could not slip out of. And one of the neighbors let out a quiet whisper, the kind that travels faster than shouting. "That is the HOA president," as if that explained everything, as if that ended the conversation before it even started. And I watched the deputy's posture shift just a fraction. Not aggressive, just cautious, the kind of body. Language that says this is becoming paperwork, this is becoming a report, and reports always need someone to be in the wrong. And Margaret knew that. You could see in the way she held her chin just a little higher, in the way she kept her shoulders squared toward me like she was presenting evidence in a courtroom that only existed in her head. And I finally took a slow breath, the lake air cool in my chest, steady, grounding, because this was the part most people get wrong, this moment right. Here, where emotion feels like the right answer, but patience is the only thing that actually works. And I let my eyes drift back to the cabin, to the front door, slightly open, to the brass handle catching sunlight, to the faint creak of wood expanding in the morning heat. Every detail familiar, every detail mine in a way she did not even understand. And Margaret followed my gaze, misreading it completely, mistaking calm for uncertainty. You see that, officers, he is hesitating, she said, almost triumphant, like she had just proven something important, and I almost smiled at that. Not because it was funny, but because it was predictable, because people like her always think silence means weakness, when really it just means you're letting them walk further out onto a ledge they built themselves. And the deputy cleared his throat, polite but firm. Sir, do you have any documentation showing you have permission to be here? And there was the question that mattered, finally. Asked, finally grounded in something real, and I shifted slightly, gravel pressing under my boots, keys still resting against my palm, and I could feel Margaret's attention snap to me, sharp, focused, waiting for me. To fumble, waiting for me to confirm the story she had already decided was true, and I let a second pass, then another, just enough to stretch the moment, just enough to make everyone lean in without realizing they were doing it. And I spoke calm, even like I was explaining something simple. I do not need permission. And you could feel the ripple that sentence created, small, but immediate, like a stone dropped into still water. And Margaret's smile flickered, just for a fraction of a second, before she recovered, doubling down. That is exactly what someone trespassing would say. She snapped, louder now, voice climbing, trying to take back control of the moment that was already slipping, and I nodded slightly, acknowledging her without giving her anything, and reached into my jacket, slow enough that the deputy could see every movement, deliberate, controlled, and pulled out a folded set of papers, edges worn just enough to show they had been handled, not staged, not printed 5 minutes ago, and I did not open them yet. I just held them there between us like a line she had already crossed without realizing it. And I looked at the deputy, not at her because she was no longer the one this was about. And I said, before we go any further, you might want to take a look at the lease tied to that mailbox. And this time when I glanced toward it, everyone followed, every head turning in the same direction, every assumption starting to shift, just slightly, just enough to crack. The deputy's eyes moved from me to the mailbox and back again, slower this time, like he was recalibrating something in his head, and I could hear the faint buzz of someone's phone camera zooming in from across the gravel, the soft digital click breaking the quiet in a way that made everything feel sharper, more real, and Margaret stepped in quickly, too quickly, trying to pull the moment back under her control. That is irrelevant, she said, her voice tightening just enough to betray the shift she felt but would never admit. The HOA governs this entire lakeside section, and I am authorized to enforce those rules. And she held that folder up again like it was a shield, but this time it looked thinner, less certain, like even the paper knew it was out of its depth, and the deputy did not respond right away, which was new, because before that he had been following her rhythm, her pace. But now there was a pause, a real one, the kind that lets doubt in, and I unfolded the papers in my hands, slow, deliberate, letting the sound of the creased edges cutting through the air carry just enough weight to draw attention. And I could feel every set of eyes shift with it, every assumption starting to loosen, and I held the top page out, angled just enough for the deputy to read without stepping closer. And I said nothing because the words on that page are going to do more than anything I could add. And he leaned in slightly, scanning, his expression changing in small increments, not dramatic, just precise, the way professionals adjust when facts replace assumptions. And Margaret noticed it immediately. You could see it in the way her shoulders stiffened, in the way her smile flattened. And she tried again, louder now. We do not need to look at that, officer. This is a simple trespassing situation, but it did not land the same. Not anymore, because now there was a second narrative in the air, one she did not control. And the deputy spoke, not to her, but to me. This document shows ownership. He said carefully, like he was choosing each word with intention, and I nodded once, small, steady, and let him keep going because this was his moment to connect. The dots, not mine to force it. And he flipped the page slightly, eyes tracking a line, then another, and I could almost hear the click as it settled into place. And Margaret took a step closer, heel sharp against the wood again, but this time there was a hint of urgency in it. That cannot be correct, she said, faster now. I have lived here for 2 years. I pay dues. I follow the covenants. And there it was, the part she thought mattered, the part she believed gave her authority. And I finally looked at her again, not confrontational, just direct. And I spoke in the same calm tone I had used from the start. You rent here. And the words landed differently than anything before. Not loud, not aggressive, just precise. And for a second, she did not respond, like her mind needed an extra beat to process what did not fit her version of things. And the deputy glanced back at the mailbox, then at the paper, then at her, the sequence clear, logical, undeniable, and the air shifted again, subtle but unmistakable, like the balance of the entire scene had tilted without anyone physically moving. And one of the neighbors lowered their phone slightly, the energy of the recording changing from spectacle to something closer to realization. And Margaret's voice came back, sharper now. I have a lease agreement, she said, almost defensively, like she had just found a foothold. And I nodded, acknowledging it without giving ground. You do, I said, and let that sit for a fraction of a second before adding, signed with my company. And that was the moment it broke open, not with noise, not with drama, but with clarity, the kind that does not need to be explained twice. And the deputy straightened just slightly, posture shifting from enforcement to evaluation. And I could see it in his eyes. The situation was no longer what it had been 5 minutes ago, and Margaret stood there, still holding her folder, still framed like she was in charge, but the center had moved, and she had not realized it until it was already gone. Margaret's grip tightened around her folder, the edges bending slightly under the pressure of fingers that were no longer steady. And for the first time since the sirens cut through the morning, she did not speak immediately, which told me more than anything she had said so far, because people like her always fill silence unless they're suddenly unsure what comes next. And the lake behind us kept moving like nothing had changed, small waves tapping against the dock in a steady rhythm that made the whole scene feel even more unreal, like the world refused to match the tension standing on that wood. And the deputy glanced down at the lease again, then back at her, then at me, recalculating everything without saying it out loud. And when he finally spoke, his tone had shifted, less directed, more neutral. Ma'am, how long have you been renting this property? And the word renting hung in the air like a correction she could not ignore, and she straightened instinctively, chin lifting, trying to reclaim ground that had already slipped. I am not renting. I am a resident of this community, she said, each word clipped, controlled, but there was a strain underneath it now, something tight, something defensive, and I watched the moment settle in. The difference between what she believed and what was written in ink starting to pull apart right in front of everyone. And I let the quiet stretch again, not out of hesitation, but because timing matters, because the truth lands harder when people arrive at it themselves. And one of the neighbors shifted their weight on the gravel, the faint crunch sounding louder than it should have, like even the ground was paying attention now. And the deputy flipped to the second page, scanning more carefully, his finger tracing a line, then stopping, and he looked up at her again. This lease is active, he said, simple, factual, and Margaret's eyes flicked toward the paper for the first time, really looking at it, not dismissing it, not waving it away, but measuring it. And that was new. That was the crack widening, and she took a step forward, reaching slightly. Let me see that, she said, but the deputy did not hand it over, not yet, not until he finished reading, and that small hesitation spoke volumes. because authority had shifted again, quietly, decisively, and I could see it. In the way her posture faltered for just a second before she corrected it, shoulders pulling back, expression tightening, and she tried to pivot, try to regain control through a different angle. Even if that were true, which I'm not conceding, the HOA has rules about unauthorized access, she said faster now, stacking words like they could rebuild what was already gone, and I nodded slightly, acknowledging the attempt without engaging it, because this was no longer about rules written in a booklet. This was about ownership written in a contract, and those two things do not carry the same weight. Not even close. And the deputy seemed to reach that same conclusion at the same time, because when he spoke again, it was directed at me, not her. Sir, can you confirm you are the property owner listed here? And I met his eyes, steady, and answered without hesitation, yes. And that single word settled heavier than anything Margaret had said all morning, because it did not need explanation. It did not need decoration. It just existed, clear and complete, and I watched her process it. Watched the way her expression shifted from certainty to calculation, like she was searching for a way around. Something that did not have an opening, and the folder in her hands lowered slightly, almost unconsciously. The paper no longer held up like a shield, and the neighbors who had been whispering earlier were quiet now. Phones still raised, but no longer moving, like they were waiting for the conclusion they could feel coming but could not yet name. And I took a small step forward, not aggressive, just enough to close the distance between confusion and clarity, and I spoke again, calm, measured, the same tone I had used from the start. You called them to remove me from a property you lease, and I let that sentence sit exactly where it needed to, not louder, not softer, just precise. And for the first time since this started, Margaret did not have an immediate response, her silence louder than anything she had said before, and in that silence, everything shifted into place. The silence stretched longer than anyone expected, thick and heavy, broken only by the soft lapping of water against the dock and the distant hum of a boat engine somewhere across the lake. And Margaret finally moved, not forward this time, but slightly back, just a half step, almost unnoticeable unless you were watching for it. And because that was the first real sign that certainty had left her, and she cleared her throat, trying to reset the moment, trying to rebuild the authority she had walked in with. There must be some kind of mistake, she said, slower now, more measured, like she was choosing each word carefully instead of throwing them out with confidence. And the deputy did not respond right away, still holding the lease, still reading it like it might say something different if he gave it enough time, and I could see the exact point where his posture fully shifted, where he stopped treating me like a potential problem and started treating the situation like something else entirely, something procedural, something that required clarity instead of assumption. And he handed the document back to me with a small nod, not dramatic, just respectful. And that small motion carried more weight than anything that had happened so far, because it confirmed what the room already knew, but had not yet said out loud. And Margaret saw it too, her eyes tracking the movement, her lips pressing together as if she could physically hold her argument in place. And she tried again, quicker this time, a little sharper. Even if you're the owner, you cannot just show up without notice. There are HOA regulations, there are processes, and there was again the word regulations, but it sounded thinner now, less like a rule and more like a habit she could not break. And I let out a slow breath, feeling the calm settle deeper, because this was the part where most people raise their voice, where they push back, but that never wins. Not really. And I spoke the same way I had from the beginning, steady, controlled. My lease agreement does not require notice for property access. And I watched that land, watched the way her eyes flicked for a split second, searching, calculating, trying to find something in her memory that could counter it, and finding nothing. And one of the neighbors shifted again, this time not whispering, just watching, the energy around them completely different now, no longer waiting for confrontation, but for a conclusion. And the deputy adjusted his stance, shoulders relaxing slightly, and addressed her directly. Ma'am, based on this document, he has legal access to the property. And the tone was clear, not confrontational, just final in a way that did not invite argument. And Margaret opened her mouth, then stopped, the words not forming the way they had before. And for a moment she just stood there, the folder in her hands now hanging at her side, no longer a shield, no longer anything more than paper. And I could see in her expression, that exact second where the narrative she built collapsed under something simpler, something stronger, and she tried one last time, quieter now, almost controlled. I was just trying to enforce community standards, and the sentence felt smaller than everything that came before it. Like even she knew it did not carry the same weight anymore. And I nodded once, acknowledging the statement without agreeing with it, and looked past her toward the lake again, the sunlight reflecting off the surface in steady ripples, and then back at her, meeting her eyes for just a moment. And I said, you called law enforcement to remove the person who owns the property you live in. And I did not raise my voice, did not add anything to it, because I did not need to. The sentence was complete on its own, and the deputy let out a quiet breath through his nose. The kind of sound that signals a situation has resolved itself without needing further escalation. And he took a small step back, creating space, not between us, but around the moment, and the neighbors began lowering their phones one by one. The spectacle over, replaced by something quieter, something more grounded, and Margaret stood there, still, the confidence that carried her here now gone, replaced by something else entirely, something that looked a lot like realization, and the lake kept moving behind us, steady, unchanged, like it had seen this kind of thing before. Margaret's eyes drifted past me, toward the cabin, like she was seeing it for the first time, not as something she controlled, not as part of her carefully managed version of the neighborhood, but as something separate, something she had been standing inside without ever really understanding, and the breeze off the lake picked up just enough to move the edge of her blouse, soft fabric shifting against a moment that had gone completely still, and I could hear one of the deputies shift his weight. Behind me, gravel pressing under his boots with a slow crunch that echoed louder now that no one was talking. And that was the strange part, how quickly everything had gone quiet after being so loud just minutes ago, like the entire scene had exhaled all at once, and was now waiting to see what would fill the space next. And Margaret finally looked back at me, not with the same sharp edge, not with that rehearsed authority, but with something more measured, something closer to caution. And she said, "No one ever told me." The words coming out slower than before, less certain, like she was testing them as she spoke, and I nodded slightly, not dismissing it, not agreeing with it either, just acknowledging the statement for what it was, because information does not change ownership, and assumptions do not rewrite contracts. And she took another breath, deeper this time, and adjusted her posture again, trying to rebuild something that felt stable. "The HOA handles everything out here," she added, softer now, like she was explaining her logic rather than defending it. And I let that settle for a moment because I understood where it came from, that belief that structure equals authority, that if something looks official enough, it must be absolute. And I had seen it before, over and over again. People confusing management with ownership, rules with rights. And I spoke carefully, not to challenge her, but to place the truth exactly where it belonged. "The HOA manages guidelines," I said, steady, "but they do not own the land." And the distinction sat there between us, simple, clear, and impossible to ignore, and the deputy gave a small nod, almost imperceptible, but enough to confirm that the line had been drawn correctly. And Margaret's gaze dropped for a second, just long enough to break that steady eye contact she had held since the beginning. And when she looked back up, there was a different kind of awareness in her expression, not defeat, not exactly, but recognition, like she had just realized the limits of something she thought had none. And one of the neighbors let out a quiet breath, the sound barely audible, but noticeable in the stillness. And a couple of phones lowered completely now, the need to record replaced by the understanding that the outcome had already happened, even if no one had formally declared it. And I slipped the lease back into my jacket, the paper folding with a soft rustle that felt like closing a chapter, not dramatically, just naturally, The way things end when they reach their logical conclusion, and the deputy cleared his throat lightly, shifting his attention back to Margaret. "Ma'am, there does not appear to be any violation here," he said, professional, neutral. And that was it. No warning, no escalation, just a statement of fact that left no room for reinterpretation, and Margaret nodded once, a small motion. Controlled, like she was choosing to accept it rather than being forced. 2. And she stepped back another half step, heels softer this time against the wood, no longer striking, just moving, and I watched the way her shoulders settled, the tension easing just enough to show that she understood, even if she did not like it. And the lake continued its quiet rhythm behind us, sunlight dancing across the surface in steady patterns, unchanged by everything that had just unfolded. And I turned slightly toward the cabin, the familiar creak of the dock under my weight, grounding the moment again, bringing it back to something simple, something real. And as I reached for the door, I paused just long enough to glance back at her, not with judgment, not with triumph, just with clarity. And I said, "If you ever have questions about the property, you can reach out directly," and left it there, not as a challenge, not as a reminder, but as a fact she could choose to acknowledge or ignore. And the door opened with that same familiar sound, wood against frame, steady, and unchanged, like it had been waiting for me the entire time. The door closed behind me with a soft, familiar thud, the kind of sound that settles into your chest when you know exactly where you are and why you are there. And for a moment, I just stood inside, letting the quiet wrap around me, the faint scent of aged wood and lake air still lingering in the room like it had been waiting, unchanged, patient. And through the window, I could still see the dock, the deputies stepping back toward their vehicles, the red and blue lights now dimmer against the daylight, and Margaret standing near the edge of the gravel, not moving, not speaking, just watching. And that was new, because before she had filled every second with noise, with certainty, with direction, and now she was still like she was recalculating something deeper than just the situation, something about how she had seen the world out here. And I walked slowly across the room, boots soft against the floorboards, each step grounding, each creak a reminder that this place was not defined by anyone else's version of it. And I set my keys down on the small wooden table near the door, the metal making a quiet click that echoed, more than it should have in the silence. And I glanced at the lease again in my hand before folding it neatly and placing it beside the keys, not out of necessity, but out of habit, because documents like they're not just paper, they're structure, their clarity, they're the difference between assumption and fact. And outside I could hear a car door close, then another, the deputies leaving without urgency, without tension, just another call resolved, another misunderstanding corrected. And I moved toward the window, resting my hand lightly against the frame, feeling the warmth of the sun coming through the glass. And Margaret finally turned, not sharply, not with that same commanding energy, but slowly, deliberately, like each movement now carried more weight than before. And she took a few steps toward her car, then paused, looking back once more at the cabin, at the dock, at the space she had believed she controlled. And I could see it in that pause, the moment where something shifts internally, where certainty gets replaced with awareness, and it does not happen loudly, it does not announce itself. It just settles in, quiet and undeniable. And she opened her car door, the hinge creaking slightly, and sat inside, the door closing with a muted thump that felt final in a way words never could. And the remaining neighbors began to drift away, small conversations picking up in low tones, the kind that carry curiosity instead of judgment. And I stepped back from the window, letting the scene outside fade into the background, because it was no longer the focus. It had already resolved itself. And I moved deeper into the cabin, running my hand along the edge of the counter, feeling the worn texture of something that had been here long before any HOA, long before any rules or committees or assumptions about authority. And I poured a glass of water from the sink, the steady stream filling the room with a simple, grounding sound, and took a slow sip, the coolness sharp and clean. And I thought about how quickly things can escalate when people confuse position with ownership, when they assume that being in charge of something means they control all of it, and how quietly that illusion falls apart when it meets something real, something documented, something that does not need to argue to exist. And I set the glass down gently, the base touching the wood with a soft tap, and walked back toward the door, opening it again just enough to let the lake air move through the space, carrying that fresh, clean scent back inside. And I stepped onto the dock, the boards warm under my boots now. The sunlight fully settled over the water, and everything felt steady. Again, balanced, like it had corrected itself without needing force, without needing noise. And I looked out across the lake, the surface smooth and wide, reflecting a sky that did not care about what had just happened. And I let out a slow breath, not in relief, not in victory, just in acknowledgement, because moments like that are not about winning. They're about clarity, about understanding exactly where you stand, and knowing that you do not need to raise your voice when the truth is already written down. The lake had settled into that late morning stillness where everything feels suspended in place. Sunlight stretching across the surface in long, quiet lines, and I leaned slightly against the railing of the dock, letting the warmth soak through my sleeves while the air carried that mix of water and distant pine, clean and steady. And for a moment, it felt like the entire morning had already folded itself into memory, like it had happened faster than it should have. But the faint sound of a car, engine turning over, pulled me back, low and controlled. I glanced toward the gravel road just as Margaret's vehicle shifted into motion, tires rolling slowly at first, almost hesitant-like. Even leaving required a different kind of awareness now, and she stopped again just before the bend, not fully turning away, just pausing long enough to look back one last time. And this time there was no performance in it, no posture, no raised chin or measured tone, just a quiet evaluation, like she was seeing the place without the filter she had been using before. And I did not move, did not wave, did not acknowledge it beyond simply standing there, because not every moment needs to be answered out loud. And after a second longer, she pulled away, the sound of the engine fading gradually until it blended into the background of the lake, and the road returned to stillness, empty again like nothing had happened at all. And I exhaled slowly, not out of tension, but out of rhythm, matching the quiet around me. And I stepped back toward the cabin, the boards shifting under my weight with that familiar creak. And as I reached the door, I noticed the mailbox again, sunlight catching. The edge of the metal, her name still printed clearly across the front, unchanged, but it felt different now. Not because the letters had moved, but because the meaning behind them had finally aligned with reality. And I ran my fingers lightly along the top of it, feeling the slight roughness of the paint. And for a brief second, I thought about how many times she had walked past it without really seeing it, without understanding what it actually represented, and how easy it is to assume control when everything around you seems to confirm it, and how quickly that assumption falls apart when something solid pushes back, something that does not bend, does not argue, does not need to prove itself beyond existing. And I stepped inside again, leaving the door open just enough for the breeze to move through, carrying the sound of water with it, soft and constant. And I moved toward the table where I had set the lease earlier, picking it up once more, not because I needed to read it, but because holding it felt like holding the structure of the entire situation, every line, every signature, every clause quietly doing its job without ever needing to raise its voice. And I folded it carefully, precise, deliberate, and placed it back down exactly where it had been, because some things do not need to move to be effective. And I walked over to the window again, looking out across the lake, the reflection steady, uninterrupted, and I thought about how different this could have gone if I had reacted the way most people do, louder, sharper, trying to win the moment instead of letting it unfold, and how that would have only added noise to something that was already clear from the start. And I rested my hand against the frame, the wood warm under my palm, and let the quiet settle fully, complete, and somewhere in the distance a bird cut across the sky, its shadow skimming the water for just a second before disappearing. and I found myself smiling, not because of what had happened, but because of how it had ended, not with force, not with confrontation, but with something simpler, something more permanent. The kind of resolution that does not fade once the moment passes. And I glanced once more toward the road, now empty, and then back at the lake, and everything felt exactly where it was supposed to be. The afternoon light stretched longer across the lake, turning the water into a slow sheet of gold that moved without urgency. And I sat on the edge of the dock with my boots just above the surface, listening to the quiet rhythm that had returned like nothing had ever interrupted it. And that was the part that always stayed with me. Not the confrontation, not the raised voices or the flashing lights, but how quickly everything resets once the truth settles in, like the world itself refuses to carry tension longer than it has to. And I leaned back slightly on my hands, feeling the rough grain of the wood press into my palms, solid, familiar, unchanged by any of it. And I thought about the way Margaret had stood there earlier, so certain, so convinced that authority came from position, from titles, from being the loudest voice in the room, and how that certainty had unraveled the moment it met something quieter but stronger, something written down, something that did not need to argue, to exist. And I could still picture that exact second when it shifted, when the deputy's tone changed, when the weight of the situation moved from assumption to fact, and how everything after that was just gravity doing its job, pulling things back into place. And I reached over to the side, picking up a small stone from the dock and turning it between my fingers, smooth from years of water and time, shaped without force, just persistence. And I let it drop into the lake, watching the ripples spread outward and slow, even circles, each one fading into the next until the surface was still again, and it felt like the perfect reflection of what had happened. No explosion, no dramatic end, just a quiet correction that moved through everything and then disappeared, leaving only clarity behind. And I stood up slowly, brushing my hands against my jeans, and turned back toward the cabin, the open door framing the interior in warm light. And I stepped inside, the floorboards creaking softly under my weight, the sound grounding, consistent, like it had been repeating, the same note for years without ever needing to change. And I walked over to the table where the lease rested, still exactly where I had placed it, edges aligned, paper flat, and I placed my hand on it for a moment, not out of habit this time, but out of recognition, because that single document had carried more authority than any voice raised outside, more control than any rule book waved in the air, and it had done it without noise, without urgency, just by existing.